How to Be an Anti-Racist, by Ibram X. Kendi is a powerful and thought-provoking book that explores the concept of racism and what it means to be an anti-racist. Here are some of the important points from the book. Racism is not just about individual acts of prejudice or discrimination. It is a system of power and privilege that operates at all levels of society, from individual attitudes and behaviors to laws and policies. Everyone has the capacity to be racist, regardless of their race or ethnicity. It is important to recognize our own biases and work to overcome them. Being not racist is not enough. We must actively work to be anti-racist, which means actively challenging and dismantling racist systems and structures. We need to redefine what it means to be racist and anti-racist. Instead of seeing them as fixed states of being, we should view them as actions and choices that we make in our daily lives. Intersectionality is crucial in understanding and addressing racism. We must recognize that different forms of oppression, such as racism, sexism, homophobia, and ableism, are interconnected and reinforce each other. Education is key to becoming anti-racist. We need to educate ourselves about the history and impact of racism, and we need to be willing to have difficult conversations about race and racism. It is not enough to be passive allies. We must actively work to support and empower marginalized communities and use our privilege to create change. We must be willing to make mistakes and learn from them. Being anti-racist is a lifelong journey, and we will make missteps along the way. It is important to reflect on our mistakes, acknowledge them, and use them as opportunities for growth and learning. Kendi argues that the concept of race is a social construct, rather than a biological fact. Racism, therefore, is not based on biology but rather on social and political power dynamics. Kendi suggests that the idea of a post-racial society is a myth. Racism still exists, even if it is not always overt or explicit. It is important to acknowledge and confront racism in all its forms, even when it is not immediately visible. One of the key ways that racism operates is through policies and practices that disproportionately harm marginalized communities. These policies and practices may not be explicitly racist, but they still have a racist impact. Kendi emphasizes the importance of centering the experiences and voices of people of color in discussions of race and racism. It is not enough for white people to speak out against racism. We must also listen to and learn from people of color. Kendi challenges the idea of colorblindness, arguing that it is not possible or desirable to ignore race. Instead, we should acknowledge and celebrate the diversity of human experience while working to dismantle racist systems and structures. One of the most important steps in becoming anti-racist is to examine our own biases and assumptions. We all have blind spots and implicit biases, and it is important to recognize and challenge them. Finally, Kendi argues that being anti-racist is not just a personal choice or lifestyle, but a political commitment. We must work to create systemic change, including advocating for policies and practices that promote racial equity and justice. Kendi argues that there are not racist actions or policies. All actions and policies have the potential to perpetuate or challenge racism. It is important to actively seek out and promote anti-racist policies and practices. The book highlights the importance of taking a holistic approach to anti-racism. It is not enough to focus solely on individual attitudes or behaviors. We must also work to change systems and structures that perpetuate racism. Kendi emphasizes the importance of self-reflection and humility in the process of becoming anti-racist. We must be willing to acknowledge our own mistakes and limitations, and be open to learning from others. The book challenges the idea that racism can be eradicated through colorblind policies or a focus on individual attitudes. Instead, it emphasizes the need for active and ongoing work to dismantle racist structures and systems. Kendi suggests that anti-racism requires a willingness to be uncomfortable and to confront difficult truths. We must be willing to engage in difficult conversations and confront our own biases and assumptions in order to create meaningful change. The book emphasizes the role of education in becoming anti-racist. It suggests that we need to learn about the history and impact of racism, as well as the ways in which it operates today. Education can help us to understand how racism is perpetuated and how we can work to challenge it. Kendi argues that anti-racism is not just about opposing racism, but about actively promoting racial equity and justice. This requires us to be proactive in advocating for policies and practices that promote equity and challenge racism. The book suggests that anti-racism requires a commitment to ongoing learning and growth. We must be willing to listen to and learn from people of color, as well as to reflect on our own biases and assumptions. Kendi argues that anti-racism requires us to embrace discomfort and to be willing to take risks. We must be willing to challenge the status quo and to disrupt systems and structures that perpetuate racism, even if it means facing criticism or opposition. The book highlights the importance of intersectionality in understanding and addressing racism. We must recognize that different forms of oppression are interconnected and reinforce each other. This requires us to consider how racism intersects with other forms of oppression, such as sexism, homophobia, and ableism. Finally, the book emphasizes the importance of hope and optimism in the fight against racism. While racism can be overwhelming and discouraging, we must remain committed to the belief that change is possible. We must believe that we can create a more just and equitable world, and work towards that vision with determination and persistence. Kendi argues that anti-racism is not just about changing individual attitudes or behaviors, but about creating systemic change. This requires us to challenge and dismantle racist policies and systems, and to advocate for policies and practices that promote equity and justice. The book challenges the idea that racism is solely a problem of personal prejudice. Instead, it suggests that racism is a systemic issue that is perpetuated by policies and structures that advantage some groups while disadvantaging others. Kendi emphasizes the importance of accountability in the fight against racism. We must hold individuals, institutions, and systems accountable for their actions and policies, and work to ensure that they are promoting equity and justice. The book highlights the importance of solidarity in the fight against racism. We must recognize that we are all interconnected and that the struggle for racial justice is not just about one group, but about creating a more just and equitable world for all. Kendi argues that anti-racism requires us to confront uncomfortable truths about our history and society. This requires us to be willing to engage in difficult conversations and to acknowledge the ways in which we have benefited from systemic racism. The book emphasizes the importance of collective action in the fight against racism. We must work together to challenge and dismantle racist systems and structures, and to advocate for policies and practices that promote equity and justice. Kendi argues that anti-racism requires us to be willing to take risks and to challenge the status quo. This requires us to be willing to confront uncomfortable truths and to disrupt systems and structures that perpetuate racism. Finally, the book emphasizes the importance of hope and perseverance in the fight against racism. While the struggle for racial justice may be long and difficult, we must remain committed to the belief that change is possible and that we can create a more just and equitable world. Kendi suggests that anti-racism requires a reimagining of our society and our systems. This involves not just opposing racism, but actively promoting policies and practices that prioritize equity and justice. The book challenges the idea that there is a right way to be anti-racist, or a set of rules to follow. Instead, it suggests that anti-racism is a process of ongoing learning, growth, and action. Kendi argues that anti-racism requires us to recognize and challenge the ways in which racism is embedded in our society and our systems. This requires us to confront difficult truths about our history and to acknowledge the ways in which we have benefited from systemic racism. The book highlights the importance of listening to and learning from people of color in the fight against racism. We must center the experiences and perspectives of marginalized communities, and be willing to listen to and learn from their insights and experiences. Kendi suggests that anti-racism requires us to be willing to challenge our own biases and assumptions. We must be open to the possibility that we may be wrong, and be willing to learn from our mistakes. The book emphasizes the importance of community in the fight against racism. We must work together to challenge and dismantle racist systems and structures, and to advocate for policies and practices that promote equity and justice. Kendi argues that anti-racism requires us to reject the idea of a colorblind society, and instead embrace the diversity and richness of different racial and ethnic identities. The book highlights the importance of understanding the historical roots of racism in our society. We must recognize the ways in which racism has been perpetuated and how it continues to impact people of color today. Kendi emphasizes the importance of taking action in the fight against racism. It is not enough to simply oppose racism. We must actively work to dismantle racist systems and structures and promote equity and justice. The book challenges the idea that racism is a problem of the past, and emphasizes the ways in which racism continues to impact people of color today. We must recognize that racism is not just an individual problem, but a systemic issue that requires systemic solutions. Kendi suggests that anti-racism requires us to be willing to speak out against racism, even when it is uncomfortable or unpopular. We must be willing to challenge racist ideas and practices, and to advocate for policies and practices that promote equity and justice. The book highlights the importance of self-reflection in the fight against racism. We must be willing to examine our own biases and assumptions, and to challenge the ways in which we have been socialized to perpetuate racism. Kendi argues that anti-racism requires us to recognize and address the ways in which different forms of oppression intersect and reinforce each other. We must work to challenge all forms of oppression, including racism, sexism, homophobia, ableism, and more. The book emphasizes the importance of centering the experiences and perspectives of people of color in the fight against racism. We must recognize that people of color are experts on their own experiences, and be willing to listen to and learn from them. Kendi suggests that anti-racism requires us to be willing to challenge our own assumptions and beliefs about race and racism. We must be open to new perspectives and be willing to engage in difficult conversations. Finally, the book highlights the importance of persistence and resilience in the fight against racism. While the struggle for racial justice may be long and difficult, we must remain committed to the belief that change is possible, and continue to work towards that vision with determination and hope. Kendi argues that anti-racism requires us to be willing to confront and challenge the ways in which racism operates within ourselves, as well as within our society. This means recognizing and challenging our own implicit biases and prejudices. The book emphasizes the importance of intersectionality in the fight against racism. We must recognize the ways in which race intersects with other forms of oppression, such as gender, sexuality, class, and more. Kendi suggests that anti-racism requires us to be willing to examine the ways in which our language and communication perpetuate racist ideas and stereotypes. We must be mindful of the words we use and the messages we convey, and work to promote more inclusive and equitable communication practices. The book highlights the importance of education in the fight against racism. We must work to promote an education system that promotes equity and justice, and teaches students about the historical and systemic roots of racism. Kendi argues that anti-racism requires us to be willing to engage in uncomfortable and difficult conversations about race and racism. We must be willing to challenge our own assumptions and biases, and to listen to and learn from the experiences and perspectives of others. The book challenges the idea that racism is solely an individual problem, and emphasizes the ways in which racism is embedded within our society and our systems. We must work to challenge and dismantle racist structures and policies, and promote more equitable and just systems. Kendi suggests that anti-racism requires us to recognize and challenge the ways in which power and privilege operate within our society. We must work to promote more equitable distribution of power and resources, and to challenge systems that perpetuate inequality. The book highlights the importance of allyship in the fight against racism. We must work to support and uplift the voices and experiences of people of color, and to use our own privilege and power to challenge and dismantle racist systems. Kendi argues that anti-racism requires us to be willing to challenge the ways in which our culture and media perpetuate racist ideas and stereotypes. We must be critical consumers of media and cultural products, and work to promote more inclusive and equitable cultural practices. Finally, the book emphasizes the importance of hope in the fight against racism. We must remain committed to the belief that change is possible, and work towards a vision of a more equitable and just society. Kendi emphasizes the importance of recognizing the ways in which different groups experience racism differently. For example, he notes that black women may face different forms of discrimination than black men, and that the experiences of immigrant communities may be different from those of native-born Americans. The book highlights the importance of recognizing and challenging the ways in which policies and practices may have disproportionate impacts on different racial and ethnic groups. We must work to promote policies that are equitable and just, and that address the specific needs and experiences of different communities. Kendi suggests that anti-racism requires us to be willing to challenge the ways in which our economic system perpetuates racial inequality. We must work to promote economic policies that are equitable and just, and that address the specific economic challenges faced by communities of color. The book emphasizes the importance of recognizing and addressing the ways in which environmental issues disproportionately impact communities of color. We must work to promote environmental policies that are equitable and just, and that address the specific environmental challenges faced by communities of color. Kendi argues that anti-racism requires us to be willing to challenge the ways in which our criminal justice system perpetuates racial inequality. We must work to promote criminal justice policies that are equitable and just, and that address the specific challenges faced by communities of color. The book highlights the importance of recognizing and challenging the ways in which our healthcare system perpetuates racial inequality. We must work to promote healthcare policies that are equitable and just, and that address the specific healthcare needs and challenges faced by communities of color. Kendi suggests that anti-racism requires us to be willing to challenge the ways in which our educational system perpetuates racial inequality. We must work to promote educational policies that are equitable and just, and that address the specific educational needs and challenges faced by communities of color. The book emphasizes the importance of recognizing and addressing the ways in which housing policies and practices perpetuate racial inequality. We must work to promote housing policies that are equitable and just, and that address the specific housing needs and challenges faced by communities of color. Kendi argues that anti-racism requires us to be willing to challenge the ways in which our immigration system perpetuates racial inequality. We must work to promote immigration policies that are equitable and just, and that address the specific challenges faced by immigrant communities. The book highlights the importance of recognizing and challenging the ways in which our voting and electoral system perpetuates racial inequality. We must work to promote voting and electoral policies that are equitable and just, and that address the specific challenges faced by communities of color. Kendi emphasizes the importance of recognizing and challenging the ways in which our historical narrative perpetuates racial inequality. We must work to promote a more accurate and inclusive understanding of history, and to recognize the contributions and experiences of communities of color. The book highlights the importance of recognizing and challenging the ways in which our cultural practices perpetuate racial inequality. We must work to promote cultural practices that are inclusive and equitable, and that recognize the contributions and experiences of communities of color. Kendi argues that anti-racism requires us to be willing to challenge the ways in which our political system perpetuates racial inequality. We must work to promote political policies that are equitable and just, and that address the specific challenges faced by communities of color. The book emphasizes the importance of recognizing and challenging the ways in which our language and terminology perpetuate racial inequality. We must work to promote language and terminology that is inclusive and equitable, and that recognizes the contributions and experiences of communities of color. Kendi suggests that anti-racism requires us to be willing to challenge the ways in which our international relations perpetuate racial inequality. We must work to promote international policies that are equitable and just, and that address the specific challenges faced by communities of color around the world. The book highlights the importance of recognizing and challenging the ways in which our religious practices perpetuate racial inequality. We must work to promote religious practices that are inclusive and equitable, and that recognize the contributions and experiences of communities of color. Kendi argues that anti-racism requires us to be willing to challenge the ways in which our social and cultural norms perpetuate racial inequality. We must work to promote social and cultural norms that are equitable and just, and that address the specific challenges faced by communities of color. The book emphasizes the importance of recognizing and challenging the ways in which our scientific and technological practices perpetuate racial inequality. We must work to promote scientific and technological practices that are inclusive and equitable, and that recognize the contributions and experiences of communities of color. Kendi suggests that anti-racism requires us to be willing to challenge the ways in which our artistic practices perpetuate racial inequality. We must work to promote artistic practices that are inclusive and equitable, and that recognize the contributions and experiences of communities of color. Finally, the book emphasizes the importance of recognizing and challenging the ways in which our personal relationships perpetuate racial inequality. We must work to build relationships that are inclusive and equitable, and that recognize the value and dignity of all individuals, regardless of race or ethnicity. One of the key points in the book is the idea that there is no such thing as a not racist person. Kendi argues that everyone has internalized biases and that it is only by actively working to be anti-racist that we can make progress towards equality. Kendi also challenges the idea of colorblindness, arguing that it is not enough to simply ignore race or pretend that it does not exist. Instead, we must actively work to address and confront racial inequality. The book emphasizes the importance of intersectionality, or the idea that individuals can experience discrimination or disadvantage based on multiple aspects of their identity, including race, gender, sexuality, and class. Kendi argues that anti-racism is not just about addressing individual acts of discrimination, but also about addressing systemic inequalities and structures of power that perpetuate racial inequality. The book highlights the importance of listening to and centering the voices and experiences of people of color, and of working to understand and empathize with their experiences. Kendi also emphasizes the importance of taking action and not just talking about anti-racism, including supporting anti-racist policies and candidates, and using our own privilege and resources to promote equity and justice. The book emphasizes the importance of recognizing and challenging the ways in which implicit biases and stereotypes can impact our actions and decisions, and of working to actively counteract these biases. Kendi also highlights the importance of education in promoting anti-racism, both in terms of educating ourselves and others about the history and impacts of racism, and in terms of working to create more equitable and inclusive educational systems. The book emphasizes the importance of recognizing and challenging the ways in which economic inequality perpetuates racial inequality, and of working to promote economic policies that are equitable and just. Finally, Kendi argues that anti-racism requires a sustained commitment to action and to ongoing self-reflection and learning, and that it is only through this ongoing work that we can make progress towards a more equitable and just society.